Australia has built one of the most sophisticated livestock tracking systems in the world. It's so advanced that it can trace a single animal from the day it's born to the exact moment it reaches the slaughterhouse. But most Australians have no idea it exists. And most farmers are wondering why the government is doubling down on these requirements in 2025 and 2026. This system is called the National Livestock Identification System, or NLIS, and it represents one of the most comprehensive animal tracking networks ever created. What started in 1999 as a way to manage cattle during disease outbreaks has evolved into something far more pervasive and complex. Today, it controls nearly every aspect of how livestock moves through Australia's food supply chain. The government didn't build the system overnight. It was constructed piece by piece, year by year, with little fanfare and even less public awareness. The system is elegant in its design, but daunting in its scope. Every single animal that moves off a property in Australia must wear an electronic identification tag. For cattle, this has been mandatory since 2005. For sheep and goats, it became compulsory from January 1st, 2025. The tags themselves are small, just plastic discs with embedded RFID technology. But what they represent is a complete transformation of how livestock farming operates in Australia. They are the digital fingerprints of the modern agricultural system, and they're impossible to ignore once you understand how they actually work. Here's what makes this system so remarkable. When a calf is born on a property in regional Queensland, it gets tagged before it can be moved off that land. That tag contains a unique 15-digit number. The moment that animal leaves the property, that information flows into the national NLIS database. It sits there, a permanent record, every time the animal moves from property to sale yards, from sale yards to feedlots, from feedlots to processing plants. That movement is recorded. By the time the animal reaches the slaughterhouse, there's a complete digital biography of its life. Where it came from, who owned it, what happened to it. Everything is documented and stored. The government will tell you this is essential for biosecurity. And they're not entirely wrong. When disease outbreaks happen, and they do happen, the ability to trace an animal's movements becomes literally a matter of national importance. A single disease-infected animal that's not tracked properly could contaminate an entire supply chain. That could shut down exports. That could cost the industry billions of dollars. The coronavirus pandemic showed just how fragile food supply chains really are. The NLIS system is the insurance policy against that kind of catastrophe occurring. But there's another side to this story, one that farmers have been quietly struggling with for many years now. Every property in Australia that owns livestock must register a Property Identification Code, or PIC. This is an 8-character code that uniquely identifies your land in the national database. You cannot move an animal off your property without one. Once you have a PIC, it's tied to your name, your address, and every animal you own. It's not just a database of animals anymore, it's a database of people. It's a registry that the government maintains of everyone in Australia who raises livestock, how many they have, and exactly where they are located. The costs of compliance have been substantial for most producers. While the government provides some support, Victoria now offers cattle tags for just 72 cents each, but other states are far more expensive. In Queensland, Western Australia, and New South Wales, producers can pay between $2.50 and $4 per tag. For a farmer with 1,000 head of cattle, that's between $2,500 and $4,000 just to tag the herd. And that's before you account for the labor costs. Physically tagging animals takes considerable time. It's labor-intensive work. It requires proper equipment. It requires training. And it absolutely has to be done correctly every single time. The penalties for non-compliance are severe and unforgiving. If you fail to tag an animal before moving it off your property, you face fines starting at $1,320 per animal. For a livestock producer, this isn't a slap on the wrist. This is a serious financial threat. A single mistake with a mob of cattle could result in penalties in the tens of thousands of dollars. The law doesn't care about intent. It doesn't care if you forgot. It doesn't care if you were moving the animals to a neighboring property. If the tag isn't there and the movement isn't recorded in the database, you're in violation. The system is strict and unforgiving. What's particularly interesting is how this system has evolved over the past 2 decades. Cattle have been under mandatory tagging for nearly 20 years. The farming community adapted. They built the equipment. They trained the people. They created the systems. It became part of how they operate every single day. But in January 2025, the government decided to expand this to sheep and goats, and that's when things really got contentious with producers. Sheep and goat farmers are fundamentally different from cattle producers. Many of them run smaller operations. Wool producers especially keep their animals on the same property for years. They breed, shear, and keep the same sheep for multiple years of wool production. The idea of individually tagging every single sheep suddenly seemed excessive to many farmers across the country, and the cost was absolutely shocking to them. When the government announced that sheep and goat electronic identification tagging would be mandatory, the wool industry pushed back hard against the requirements. The industry wanted three specific things. First, they wanted a national database that was consistent across all states and territories. Second, they wanted the government and industry to share the costs equally. And third, they wanted more time. Not a couple of months, not even a year. They wanted real time to implement such a massive change. Some state farmer associations actually called for delaying the sheep and goat mandate from January 2027 to January 2029. They said the system the government was building wasn't ready. They said the database upgrade was running into unexpected complexity. They said the rollout was too fast and poorly planned. But the government pushed through anyway with their timeline. And now, as of 2025 and 2026, every single sheep and goat born in Australia that moves off a property must have an electronic identification tag. The government even subsidized the tags to try to make it more palatable to farmers. In New South Wales, farmers can get tags for just $1 through a subsidy program. The government committed $41 million just to help ease the transition. But the real costs, the labor, the equipment, the time, those don't disappear just because the tags are cheaper to purchase. What's happening right now is the largest transformation of livestock identification in Australian history. And it's happening with very little public awareness among Australians. Most people have no idea that the meat in their supermarket comes from an animal that's been electronically tracked from birth to death. Most people don't know that there's a national database somewhere containing information about millions and millions of animals, and by extension, information about all the farms that own them. The technology itself is actually quite fascinating when you really examine it. The RFID tags work like tiny computers embedded in ear tags. They contain a microchip that broadcasts a unique identification number when a reader scans them. The readers can be portable, handheld devices that farmers use to scan animals at loading time, or they can be fixed installations at sale yards that passes through a reader. That movement gets recorded into the system. The system is designed to be fail-safe. If an animal's tag falls off or gets damaged, the farmer is supposed to replace it with what's called a post-breeder tag, which is orange instead of white. But if they don't replace it, then they've got an untagged animal, and that's illegal. The infrastructure required to make this system work is truly enormous in scale. Sale yards across Australia had to install scanning equipment. Processing plants had to be upgraded. Every property that moves animals regularly needs to have the capability to scan tags and record data. The government has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in building out this network. It's not something that happened overnight. It's been happening gradually, almost invisibly, for over 2 decades. The justification for all of this complexity is traceability in the event of disease, and that's a completely legitimate concern. Australia's agricultural exports are worth tens of billions of dollars. The country's reputation for food safety is one of its most valuable assets. A major disease outbreak could destroy that reputation. The 2001 foot and mouth disease outbreak in the United Kingdom demonstrated how devastating this could be. Thousands of farms were affected. Millions of animals had to be culled. The economic impact was catastrophic. Australia has never had foot and mouth disease. The government is determined to keep it that way. The NLIS system is a critical part of that strategy. But there's something else happening here as well. The more you understand the NLIS system, the more it becomes clear that it's not just about disease traceability. It's a tool for market access. Many of Australia's export markets now require traceability. Japan wants to know where its beef came from. The European Union has specific requirements about livestock identification. South Korea, China, Thailand, they all demand traceability documentation. The NLIS system is how Australia proves to the world that it can meet those requirements. It's how Australian beef commands premium prices in international markets. That said, there's a real tension at the heart of this system. On one hand, it's genuinely useful for disease control and market access. On the other hand, it's also a level of surveillance that's unusual in agricultural sectors. The government doesn't just know that a farm owns livestock. It knows exactly how many. It knows their ages, their movements, their fates. It knows if an animal went to market or if it was kept for breeding. It knows if it was sold, given away, or died on property. It's a level of visibility that's unprecedented in agricultural history. The implementation of this system has been surprisingly smooth for cattle. Farmers adapted over 20 years. They built their processes around it. The sale yards upgraded their equipment. The abattoirs installed readers. It became normal. But now, scaling it to sheep and goats is proving to be much more difficult. The sheep industry is older and more traditional. There are far more sheep than cattle. In Australia, around 60 million compared to 25 million cattle. The scale is absolutely massive, and the infrastructure simply isn't as developed. Many wool producers operate small yards that aren't equipped for electronic scanning. They're going to have to invest in new equipment, or they're going to have to do manual data entry into the system based on visual tag numbers. This is where the friction is really building up. Some farmers are genuinely concerned that the system is being rushed. They point out that the database infrastructure, NLIS 2.0 as it's being called, has run into complexity issues. They're right. The government contracted with Meat and Livestock Australia's Integrity Systems Company to oversee the database upgrade, and it's been slow going. At one point, industry leaders actually called for the government to strip MLA of the project and hand it to an independent entity. That's how serious the concerns have become. The costs of noncompliance are creating a kind of coercive pressure on the entire industry. You can't move your animals to market without tags. You can't sell them without complying with the system. Small farmers are suddenly facing significant costs to upgrade their infrastructure and adopt new processes, or they face legal and financial penalties. For marginal operations, this could be the difference between staying in business and going under. That's not a small thing. That's a real impact on real people's livelihoods and futures. There's also a question about what happens to all this data once it's collected. The NLIS database is maintained by the government, but it's also accessible to processors, exporters, and retailers. It's supposedly secure and properly protected, but databases are always a target. Hackers are always looking for ways in. What if, somewhere down the line, someone gains access to this database? What if someone can figure out which farms have which animals are valuable, which animals are moving where? That information has value, not to the animals, but to people with criminal intent. Cattle rustling is a real thing in rural Australia. Livestock theft happens. More information about where animals are could theoretically make them more vulnerable. But the government argues that the benefits far outweigh these concerns. They point to disease control. They point to market access. They point to food safety. And from a public health perspective, those are legitimate arguments. A food safety crisis that could be traced back to specific animals and specific farms can be contained much faster than one that can't. The costs to the industry and to consumers would be far higher if traceability weren't possible. What's remarkable about the NLIS system is that it's actually quite successful in practice. It works. Animals are tracked, diseases can be traced, markets value Australian livestock for their traceability. It's a system that achieves what it set out to do. But success in technical terms doesn't necessarily equal acceptance among farmers or awareness among consumers. Most people who eat Australian beef have no idea that the meat came from an animal that was individually tracked by the government. If they did, would it change their perception? Would it concern them? Or would they appreciate the food safety guarantees? The expansion to sheep and goats represents a kind of tipping point. For decades, it was just cattle. Cattle producers got used to it. They built their systems around it. But now it's spreading. Every livestock species in Australia is being drawn into this comprehensive network. Pigs are tagged, cattle are tagged, sheep are tagged, goats are tagged, camelids are tagged. The system is becoming comprehensive. And the government's goal is that by 2027 or 2028, essentially every livestock animal that moves off a property in Australia is individually identified in a national database. That's a remarkable achievement from a technological standpoint. The costs continue to be heavily debated in farming communities. Government subsidies help, but they don't eliminate the costs. Equipment needs to be purchased or upgraded. Labor is required. Training is required. Compliance systems need to be implemented. For large operations with significant capital, this is manageable. For small family farms, it can be a genuine burden. Some economists argue that this creates a competitive advantage for larger producers, who can more easily absorb the costs of compliance. Smaller producers have to dedicate proportionally more of their income to meeting regulatory requirements. Over time, this could drive consolidation in the industry. This is a pattern that's happened in agriculture in many countries throughout history. Regulations that seem neutral in their impact actually advantage large producers over small ones. The barriers to entry increase, the number of farmers decreases, the industry becomes more concentrated. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is entirely a matter of perspective. Some people would argue that large-scale, highly efficient agricultural operations are the future. They produce more food more reliably. They're more controllable. They're easier to regulate. Other people would argue that the loss of small family farms is a tragedy. The NLIS system doesn't directly cause this consolidation, but it certainly enables it. And it's hard not to notice that the expansion of the system happens at the same time that questions about farm consolidation are becoming more prominent in Australian agricultural policy discussions. The two trends reinforce each other in interesting ways. What's also worth noting is how the system has evolved technically over its history. When NLIS was first introduced, it relied on visual tags, tags with printed numbers that could be read by eye. Farmers could scan those numbers manually into the system. It was slower, more prone to errors, and labor-intensive, but it was doable. Now the system is moving toward electronic tags exclusively. The government is actually phasing out visual-only tags. The requirement is increasingly that tags must be electronically scannable. This is more efficient, it reduces errors, it's faster, but it also increases the capital costs for implementation substantially. The international context is important here too. Australia isn't alone in this. The European Union has its own cattle identification and registry system. The United States has the National Animal Identification System, though implementation has been less comprehensive. Canada has similar systems. New Zealand has them. Japan, South Korea, and other major importers of Australian beef all have their own traceability systems. The global food industry is moving toward comprehensive traceability across all livestock products. Australia is actually leading in this regard. The NLIS system is sophisticated and comprehensive. This is partly why the government is so committed to expanding it. From an international trade perspective, having a world-leading traceability system is valuable. It's a competitive advantage. Australian beef commands premium prices partly because of the traceability guarantees. If Australian farmers weren't compliant with the system, that premium would disappear. So there's an economic incentive for the government to maintain and expand the system. But the farmers are bearing the costs of maintaining that competitive advantage. They're the ones buying the tags. They're the ones implementing the systems. They're the ones dealing with the compliance requirements. They're the ones who face fines if they mess up. In that sense, the cost of Australia's food safety reputation is being passed on to the people who produce the food. The question that's worth asking is whether there's a better way to achieve the same goals. Could you have effective traceability without requiring every single animal to be individually tagged? Could you have some kind of sampling-based system that achieves most of the benefits without the full cost? Could you use newer technologies like DNA tracking or blockchain to reduce the costs of maintaining individual identification? These are questions that the industry is starting to ask. But the government seems committed to the comprehensive individual identification approach. They're investing heavily. They're pushing forward with implementation. They're providing subsidies. They're creating penalties for noncompliance. This is their path forward, and they're committed to it. Looking forward, the next few years will be critical for the system. The sheep and goat EID implementation will either succeed or struggle. If it succeeds, it will become the model for even more species. If it struggles, it could create a backlash that makes further expansion politically difficult. The government's commitment of $41 million suggests they're serious about making it work. But implementation timelines have already slipped. The complexity is proving to be greater than anticipated. There's also the human element to consider carefully. Farmers are getting older. The average age of Australian farmers is in the mid-50s. Younger people are not always choosing to enter agriculture. The skills required to manage complex regulatory systems and technological infrastructure are different from the skills that traditional farming required. Attracting young people to farming when it involves navigating all these compliance systems is harder than it was. Yet the system continues to expand. It continues to become more comprehensive. Every year, more animals are tagged. Every year, more data flows into the NLIS database. Every year, more farmers have to invest in compliance infrastructure. And every year, the Australian government gains a more complete picture of where every livestock animal is. Is this a problem? That depends on your perspective entirely. If you're concerned about food safety, about biosecurity, about protecting Australia's agricultural exports, then the system is essential. If you're concerned about the concentration of power in government hands, about surveillance, about the costs imposed on farmers, then it looks more problematic. The truth is, it's probably both things at once. The system genuinely provides important benefits. And it does impose real costs on farmers. It does represent an expansion of government oversight. What's important is that people understand what's actually happening. The NLIS system is one of the most comprehensive livestock tracking systems in the world. It's being expanded right now to cover essentially all livestock in Australia. Most people have no idea this is happening. Most farmers know but don't feel like they have much choice. And the government is committed to making it work, regardless. The story of Australia's quiet takeover isn't a story with clear villains or heroes. It's a story about the tension between the need for food safety and biosecurity on one hand, and the desire for independence and less government intrusion on the other. It's a story about the hidden costs of maintaining a modern food supply chain. It's a story that will continue to unfold over the coming years as the system becomes more comprehensive and more costly. It's a story that every Australian should be aware of, because the choices being made now will have implications for decades to come. The technical capabilities of the NLIS system are impressive. The system processes millions of livestock movements annually. It tracks not just movement, but also animal health, genetics, and production efficiency. This data is valuable. Processing companies use it to improve operations. Farmers use it to optimize breeding decisions. Export markets use it to verify quality and safety. The system has become the backbone of Australian agricultural information infrastructure. But with this power comes responsibility. The data through NLIS is sensitive. It reveals farm operations, animal inventory, and commercial transactions. If breached, it could have serious consequences. Privacy advocates worry about government policy changes. Could this system be used beyond biosecurity? Could future governments use it to impose taxes based on livestock inventory? These are concerns that sensible people have raised. The government has assured everyone that data protection is a priority. The NLIS database is segregated from other systems. Access is restricted to authorized personnel, but no system is absolutely secure. Centralized data is an attractive target. The agricultural industry faces cyber attacks. In 2024, there were documented attempts to hack into agricultural infrastructure systems. This system is changing farming practices. Real-time data about animal movements and health enables new management approaches. Farmers can use data analytics to make better decisions. They can predict disease outbreaks before they happen. They can optimize nutrition and feeding strategies. For progressive farmers, this is valuable, but for traditional farmers, it represents unwanted intrusion. The generational divide in farming is interesting. Younger farmers are comfortable with technology and data systems. They see NLIS as a tool that helps them operate efficiently. Older farmers often see it as an unnecessary burden. This divide is creating friction within farming communities and contributing to consolidation trends. Compliance costs vary enormously by operation type. For large producers, the NLIS system might cost a few dollars per animal annually. For small operations, costs are much higher per animal. Some farmers are spending thousands to upgrade infrastructure. They're hiring consultants and taking training courses. The total cost to the industry is likely hundreds of millions annually. Government subsidies help, but they're not evenly distributed. Victoria has the most generous programs. A farmer in Victoria might pay 72 cents per tag. A farmer in Queensland might pay $4. Over 1,000 head, that's a $3,000 difference. This inequality is creating political pressure to equalize subsidies. What's also interesting is that the system isn't just about moving animals. It's about the entire supply chain. When animals reach processing plants, they're scanned again. Their data is recorded. That data is tied to the meat that comes from them. So when you buy beef at a supermarket, there's technically a digital trail connecting you to the animal that produced it. Some consumers find this reassuring. It means that if there's a food safety issue, they can be immediately notified. Other consumers find it invasive. They don't want anyone knowing details about their food consumption patterns. The export market demand for traceability continues to increase. Every year there are new requirements. Some countries now want DNA testing data. Some want information about what the animal ate. Some want to know about medications or supplements. The NLIS system is constantly being upgraded to accommodate these requirements. This means farmers need to maintain better records. They need to use approved feeds and medications. They need to follow specific protocols. It's another set of requirements that increases the burden on producers. There's also an interesting economic question about who benefits from all this data. The data that flows through NLIS is theoretically the property of the farmers who own the animals, but governments and companies can access and use it. If a company uses NLIS data to develop a more efficient farming system or a profitable new product, who owns the intellectual property? Do farmers get compensated? These are questions that haven't been fully addressed. Some farmers are starting to organize to demand fair compensation for the data they're providing. Looking at the international comparison, the United States actually has a less comprehensive system. The USDA's Animal Identification Plan never achieved mandatory implementation. There was too much farmer resistance. Farmers successfully lobbied against making animal identification mandatory. As a result, the United States has less complete traceability than Australia. But American consumers don't seem to care. They buy American beef. They buy Australian beef. For most consumers, the origin and traceability of their meat isn't a major purchasing decision. So the question becomes, is the comprehensive NLIS system justified if consumers don't demand it? Australia's government would argue that they're being proactive. They're protecting the country's agricultural reputation before there's a crisis. They're ensuring that if a disease outbreak happens or if there's a food safety incident, they can respond quickly. That's a legitimate argument. But it does mean imposing costs on farmers for a benefit that might never be realized. It's insurance that costs money every year. The future of NLIS will involve more technology. AI is integrating into livestock management systems. Drones monitor animals. Wearable sensors track individual health. Blockchain is being explored for security. The system will become more sophisticated and automated. The question is whether farmers and society are ready for that level of surveillance in agriculture. What we're really looking at is the transformation of farming from an individual practice into a data-driven industrial process. Animals are becoming data points. Farms are becoming nodes in a larger network. Individual farming decisions are being influenced by algorithms and data analytics. For some, this is progress. For others, it's the death of traditional agriculture. The truth is probably that both perspectives have some validity